In the second video for technology and industry, we'll talk about some of the entrepreneurs who grew their businesses into huge industries. They were sometimes called captains of industry. One of these was John Rockefeller, and some of these names will probably sound familiar to you. Rockefeller was in the oil industry. He owned 90% of all oil in the world, including the Standard Oil Company and Trust. Andrew Carnegie owned steel businesses. He owned the American Steel Company. J.P. Morgan, that company still exists, was in business finance. So he helped front funds for big business. Vanderbilt was a railroad magnate. DuPont created the first dynamite and then built a huge business around chemical manufacturing. Westinghouse was in the electricity industry. If you remember, he's also in the inventor category, figured out how to transmit electricities over long distances, and was able to make this into a very viable industry. Duke, that name should sound very familiar to you. Duke ran a huge tobacco company. Of course, we've talked about the fact that railroads had a huge impact on the United States in many ways, and one of those, of course, was in industry. Of course, its nickname was the Iron Horse, and it was a leading consumer of goods as well as a form of transport for goods. Better transportation, of course, leads to growth and settlement of the West. And the Transcontinental Railroad, if you remember, the Central Pacific and the Union Pacific were competing to complete the first Transcontinental Railroad, and of course employed Irish and Chinese immigrants to work on the railroad. Another effect of the railroad, of course, is the standardization of time, because there was, in trying to schedule trains, there was the need for synchronized time. And so the government set up time zones for the United States. We have 4 time zones. The railroad leads to growth of urban areas all over the country. Also the development of company towns. And if you remember what a company town is, that's where a company springs up someplace and then it draws people in from all over. And so most of the people living in the town work for that company. The company owns everything in town. And this kind of dependency on the company can lead to very harsh conditions for workers. One of those companies was the Pullman Company in Illinois, which made railroad cars. There were lots of scandals, lots of corruption in the railroad industry, including grafts, government land grafts, stock fraud, and of course strikes. The public has mixed feelings about big business. The idea of social Darwinism catches on in the late 1800s, and this is based on Darwin's theory of evolution as it applies to the development of life on this planet. And this is the idea that the fittest survive and the weakest die off. And with social Darwinism, people applied it to the business world. The strongest, most thriving businesses will survive. Those that are weak will not. It also meant that those who lived in poverty were the weakest. Okay, because the best businesses will thrive. And some of the biggest business owners, the magnates, used the idea of social Darwinism to justify their wealth. Andrew Carnegie was one of these, and he wrote an article in 1889 called The Gospel of Wealth, and in it he said that individuals had the right to accumulate as much money as they wanted or could. It also, however, suggested that people had a responsibility to distribute that money to the less fortunate. So this is an idea called philanthropy, that you give money that you make away to help others. Carnegie actually gave 80% of his wealth away before his death. But there is this, there are many stories, including the story of Rockefeller, which are rags to riches story. The people who grew up in poverty and somehow clambered their way to the top and made lots and lots of money. This is the American dream. This is what people hope for, and this is what draws people to this country. Horatio Alger, of course, was the author of these dime novels, these adventure stories, quick reads, cheap books that you could pick up, and often they told rags to riches stories. One of his most famous was one called Ragged Dick. Robber barons are these business owners, these huge magnates or captains of industry like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, etc., who made very large amounts of money, often by using corrupt business practices and at the expense of employees. What this means is that these people made a lot of money, sometimes from not always doing honest things, but also they kept their workers impoverished by not paying them enough. So as more and more people start to feel resentful towards these robber barons, obviously the name robber baron is not a very positive name, as they become exposed, there begins the idea that maybe these people should engage in philanthropy. Maybe they should give away some of this money and help improve the situation of people less fortunate, also improve their own images. Of course, Carnegie was one of these. So some of the big business practices that are not so honest are being exposed, and the public begins to call for regulation of these businesses. The first legislation that's passed is called the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. And it's not very strong. It doesn't have very much oomph to it, but it does set a precedent for future laws, and that's important because as we go through the Gilded Age, we start to see other acts of legislation built upon this one. It is the first attempt to regulate big business. In the next video, we're going to cover some of the important vocabulary that we'll use when we're talking about big business and industry.